Está en inglés.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Nancy on the English channel. Yeah? Okay.
Escucho perfectamente. Perfecto. Muchas gracias.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel. English channel. Are you able to hear me? Testing English.
Good afternoon, everyone. I now open hearing number 21 of the 188th period of sessions of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is entitled Impacts of Pesticide Use on Reproductive Rights. This was requested by the following organizations: Centro de Derechos Reproductivos, I believe, Fos Feminista, Grupo de Epidemiología y Salud Poblacional, Instituto de Salud Socioambiental, Movimiento para de Fumigarnos, as well as the Campaña contra os Agrotóxicos y Pela Vida. My name is Roberta Clark, and I'm the Commissioner and Second Vice President of the plenary, and I'm accompanied to my left by Commissioner Julissa Mantilla, who, as you all know, is also the Rapporteur for the Rights of Women, and to my left, our Deputy Executive Secretary, Jorge Mesa. So I bring greetings to the civil society organizations that requested this hearing and those who may be online and listening in. Here's how we're going to manage the time. The civil society will have about 30 minutes, and then the commission will have about 25 to 30 minutes to respond, but we don't have to take that time. If we don't need to, we can turn back to the civil society because we think listening to you is the most important thing that we can do today. You then have a further 27 minutes to continue your presentation, and then we will close with 3 minutes reflections on the commission. I will also be joined, I believe, by Javier Paloma, who is the most recently appointed Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights. So with that, I turn over to representatives of civil society, and I ask you to introduce yourselves. And if you can introduce yourselves slowly so that we can really get the names down, and I won't have to be telling Jorge, did you get the name? And also, you do have time. So we have interpretation, and they have to do that. So you don't have to, you can speak at a moderate pace or even slowly. Don't feel rushed. And so I turn over to you.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm Catherine Oliveira from Fos Feminista. First, I wish to thank the Commission for agreeing to this hearing on the harm pesticides cause to reproductive health in Latin America and the Caribbean. Something historic and a first for this Commission on the subject, given that our region uses the largest amount of pesticides in the world. Our total consumption of these substances accounted for 51% of global use in 2020, or 1,357,984 of the 2,666,000 tons of pesticides used worldwide. This is relevant to reproductive justice. What is reproductive justice? Just prior to attending the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, where 179 member states recognized sexual and reproductive health as an integral part of human rights, a group of Black and Afro-descendant women developed a reproductive justice framework. The three fundamental principles of reproductive justice are the following: the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to have children in safe and healthy environments. Socio-environmental factors are fundamental to reproductive justice. The evidence of the harm generated by agrotoxins on sexual and reproductive health is uncontested and constitutes a profound violation of the sexual and reproductive rights of affected populations. In just a few moments, my colleagues will provide evidence of the devastating harm. But first, I would like to share some more global findings. In March of 2017, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and Special Rapporteur on Toxic Substances told the Human Rights Council in Geneva that the use of and protection against hazardous agrotoxins in different countries are generating double standards. Citing research that pesticides were responsible for some 200,000 poisoning deaths each year, and that most of these deaths occurred in developing countries where health and safety regulations were weakest, the experts called for a comprehensive global treaty to regulate and gradually phase out the use of hazardous pesticides. 6 years later, we are still awaiting that treaty. Some regions have taken measures to mitigate the harms of agrotoxins. In Africa, for example, countries drafted a specific regional convention, the Bamako Convention, on the ban of imports into Africa of hazardous substances. Similarly, Central American countries have adopted a specific instrument, the Central American Regional Agreement on the prohibition of the movement of hazardous waste. Both the Bamako Convention and Central American Agreement consider substances banned or not approved in their countries to be hazardous waste. We know that until a global ban on the production of these dangerous agrotoxins is adopted, pesticide companies will continue to take advantage of weaker local legislation to continue producing, exporting, and profiting from the sale of banned pesticides. Again, this is of particular concern to our region because of its serious consequences for marginalized communities. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Emiliano Maldonado, a professor of law at the Federal University of Rio Grande, and I am part of the ongoing campaign against pesticides and for life. This is comprised of Brazilian entities that fight against the use of agrotoxins. First, Latin America is the region with the highest level of land concentration in the world. Specifically in Brazil, data indicate that more than 40% of rural areas are in the hands of 1% of landowners. This is the result of colonialism and a long process of land grabbing of ancestral territories and the appropriation of peasant lands by large landowners and companies, commodity companies for export. Additionally, lands used for food production by rural communities are constantly being reduced. Extractive activities and the lack of land reform are the reason for unequal access to land and underlie the high number of conflicts in Brazil. Brazil is the deadliest country in the world for those who defend nature. Between 2012 and 2021, Brazil accounted for 20% of murders of socio-environmental activists globally. In 2022, there were more than 2,000 conflicts involving nearly 1 million people, resulting in the murder of 47 peasants, a 30% increase compared to 2021, according to the CPT. The situation of indigenous peoples is even worse. Between 2019 and 2021, there was a true genocide. 765 indigenous persons were murdered, according to CIMI. However, we are here to address a specific and extremely serious matter, namely the various cases of human rights violations that victims of toxic agrochemical contamination are suffering. Since 2008, Brazil has been the largest consumer of agrotoxins in the world. According to the FAO, in 2021, Brazil used almost 720,000 tons of pesticides, approximately 30% of which are not authorized in the European Union. Currently, Brazil uses 195 pesticides banned in Europe. This is a true chemical colonialism, as Larissa Bombardi stated in her paper, which reveals the asymmetries between the global north and the global south, since the use of these toxic substances produced by companies in the north take on characteristics of chemical weapons against peoples who reside in the countryside and protect Mother Nature. Furthermore, it has been fully documented that the rise in cases of contamination of basic goods, as well as indirect contamination, have adverse impacts on the health of these communities, particularly on women and girls whose reproductive rights are being violated. In the last decade, the Amazon has seen an increase of more than 600% of neurological disease cases. Research also indicates that more than 8,000 poisonings occurred in 2019, and that between 2010 and 2021, there were almost 10,000 cases of children poisoned from the ages of 0 to 14 years. In 2021 alone, 8,033 families suffered some brand of violence connected to pesticides. These numbers are actually an underestimate because for every reported case of poisoning, another 50 go unreported. There are even reports of cases of malicious contamination of wells, rivers, and springs, and of agro-environmental food production areas, and even attempts to poison indigenous peoples in order to expel them from their land. In recent years, cases have been reported in all regions of Brazil, particularly in conflicts involving indigenous territories and territories belonging to rural peoples and palenques, and there are strong elements of socio-environmental racism. In a study published last year, we demonstrated that having considered the most significant cases, almost 90% did not receive an adequate response from the justice system. And that is why we're reaffirming our assertion that we are being poisoned. We urgently need to ensure access to justice with full reparations for victims, and that this should be reported in the annual report of this Human Rights Commission, because these cases are a violation of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Marcia Serpa, researcher at the Brazilian Association of Public Health. This type of agriculture results in deforestation, a loss of biodiversity, and most importantly, an increase in soil, water, and air pollution. 55% of rainwater in municipalities with high agricultural production in Brazil showed residue of at least one type of agrotoxin. The same study identified water contamination with the herbicide atrazine, which is banned in the European Union. The presence of pesticides have been found in the air in agricultural regions. As far as human health is concerned, chemical contamination has been shown to cause illnesses amongst workers, rural residents, and consumers of contaminated food. Acute toxic agrochemical poisoning is characterized by symptoms such as headache, dermatitis, nausea, dizziness, convulsions, and loss of consciousness, coma, all of which can lead to death. Chronic poisoning manifests through different pathologies with an emphasis on genetic damage, cancer, hormonal dysregulation, infertility, spontaneous miscarriages, congenital malformations, and toxic effects on the reproductive system. We've observed that human exposure to pesticides has been associated with reproductive health issues and adverse events in pregnancy and lactation. Chronic exposure of women to pesticides, particularly during pregnancy, is considered a risk factor for premature birth, low birth weight, low weight for gestational age, intrauterine growth retardation, and congenital malformations. Additionally, exposure of pregnant rural women to pesticides increases the likelihood of DNA damage, which is associated to the development of cancer and acute leukemia in children under the age of 2. Cases of childhood cancer and morbidity and mortality were higher in agricultural irrigation centers. There's also a relationship between exposure and changes to the endocrine system that may interfere with the development of organs and tissues during the perinatal, prenatal period, with fetal and neonatal periods being considered more susceptible to the impacts of agrotoxins. These substances can have negative impacts on the growth and development of adolescents. This can cause early puberty, as well as direct impacts on women, for example, infertility and breast cancer. Communities exposed to these substances, particularly most vulnerable communities such as pregnant women and children and rural communities, are strongly associated with health issues such as acute poisoning, cancer, and mental and neurological issues, endocrine and immune diseases, and effects on reproductive health. These examples from Brazil show that it is urgent for the Commission to recommend a reduction in the use of pesticides in Latin America, as well as monitoring of occupational and environmental exposure as a priority health surveillance action to improve quality of life and the well-being of women and children. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Damian Versanase. I am a doctor in the School of Medical Sciences in Argentina. In Argentina, the agro-industrial model of transgenic substances associated with agrotoxins began in March 1996. And from then until 2012, the sale and use of the agrotoxins has grown 1,279%, to the point of reaching 600 million liters or kilos in 2021. These pesticides with the greatest increase were glyphosate-based herbicides, although more than 400 active ingredients are authorized for use, 107 of which are banned in other countries. And what and scientific research has shown the presence of pesticides and their metabolites in rivers, surface, streams, and groundwater, rainwater, in fruits and vegetables, and airborne particulate matter, as well as in urine, blood. Could you please speak a bit more slowly for the interpreters? Thank you. Scientific research have shown the presence of pesticides in rivers, surface streams, and groundwater and rainwater, and in the urine, blood, and breast milk of people studied. There is scientific evidence regarding the danger of these agrochemicals and their relationship with various diseases such as respiratory disorders, skin and mucous membrane lesions, endocrine disruption, development of various types of cancers, tumors, congenital malformation, reproductive disorders. Some scientific papers have found increased risk of miscarriage when exposure is to a mixture of pesticides. Similarly, distance matters. And early exposure between 3 to 8 weeks of gestation have been demonstrated as factors that increase the risk of miscarriage. Our team has shown between 2009 and 2019, we visited 40 localities in 4 provinces in Argentina with the highest rate of total exposure. We interviewed more than 140,000 people, collecting information about cancer. We saw an increase in thyroid diseases and first trimester miscarriages that went from 3.1% in 1996 to 14.3% in 2018. We also found an association between pregnancy losses and women who develop hypothyroidism. This makes it possible to identify a relationship between exposure to pesticides and forced migration. The presence of pesticides in fruits and vegetables and affects the right to food. Diseases suffered by people living in these territories are an example of violation of the right to health. We have said and we reaffirm there cannot be healthy people and communities in sick territories. For these reasons, we ask the Commission to recommend to the states the permanent prohibition of the use of glyphosate and the prohibition of the use of pesticides through aerial spraying. I am Cristina Rosario. In my country, Colombia, 69,862 tons of pesticides were used in 2019. According to the National Health Institute of Colombia, pesticides were responsible for at least 28.67% of chemical poisonings in 2014, although this is an underreporting of higher figures. Colombia implemented the illicit crop eradication program by aerial spraying and with the herbicide glyphosate as part of its policy against declared illicit crops for more than 23 years. Between 1997 and 2002 alone, more than 1,852 complaints were filed regarding deaths of children, human poisoning, damage to food crops, destruction of natural grasslands, diseases, and deaths attributed to this program. In 2020, the Universidad del Valle published a study on the effects of glyphosate, which is the most widely used pesticide in the region, concluding that there is clear consistency in favor of the harmful effects of glyphosate on reproductive health, causing infertility, miscarriages, perinatal effects, and transgenerational impacts. There are two flagship cases that have been admitted by the Commission that address reproductive health harm caused by the program. The first is that of Yeneth Valderrama, a rural woman from Caquetá who was hit by the National Police plane spraying glyphosate in September 1998. As a result, she lost her 4-month pregnancy and a few months later died. Her family was displaced from their land, fearing further harm to their health and physical safety, and they were unable to obtain any reparations in any court case due to the need for an excessive burden of proof. A petition on this case was admitted by the Commission in 2018 and is currently represented by attorneys in the Center for Reproductive Rights, still awaiting a decision on the merit. The second is that of Doris Yanez Alape. Between April and May 1999, the Colombian police massively sprayed glyphosate in the village of Tolima. This poisoned more than 26 people. Several women lost their pregnancy. Doris had a preterm birth at 28 weeks of pregnancy. As a result, her son died. Doris still has physical health problems that prevent her from working. The center recently documented the testimonies of 6 women, victims of miscarriages, who between 2000 and 2014 lived in Tarazan, Antioquia. They were exposed to glyphosate. In these cases, there were practices of institutional reproductive violence that were carried out in context of structural gaps in access to health services and strong militarization of the territories. In many cases, the lack of access to sufficient information on the risk of exposure to glyphosate have left the communities totally unprotected against the spraying. The few women who in this context have sought health services have suffered forms of obstetric violence such as omission of care or low-quality care and also in some cases mistreatment. As in other countries in the region, Colombia, access to justice for victims of deaths or health effects due to exposure to pesticides has been deficient. In just 9 years after the spraying program began, a complaints procedure was adopted. Of a total of more than 17,000 complaints filed through 2015, 96.5% were rejected or archived. In legal proceedings, plaintiffs were required to provide costly and difficult to obtain technical evidence, which in many cases prevented them from obtaining reparations. In 2022, the Truth Commission recognized the damage to reproductive health caused by the glyphosate spraying and recommended to the state measures to identify victims, improve access to justice, and prohibit definitively the use of glyphosate in the future. However, these measures have not yet been implemented. Although it had been known that the current government intended to issue a decree banning the use of glyphosate and aerial spraying as part of its drug policy, so far this has not been issued. Just to wrap up, we would like to inform the Commission that undoubtedly this is something that is very much referring to Latin America. In the case of our region, we are the region that uses the most agrotoxin globally, far more than other regions in the world. And we have seen an increase from 44% in 2000 to more than 54%. This is more than 1 million tons that are used globally. It's also important to indicate that Brazil and Argentina are the countries that use the most agrotoxins. More than 300,000 in the case of Brazil, 300,000 tons, and they're followed by Paraguay, Mexico. In most cases, the vast majority of these substances are those that are prohibited in the European Union. The harm caused by exposure lead to many violations of rights, like the right to life, physical safety, privacy, the right to found a family, judicial guarantees, health, and a healthy environment, among others. The Inter-American Court, in terms of the right to life, incorporates the right to not be prevented from having access to conditions that guarantee decent existence. Therefore, states must create social conditions for the full realization of human rights of individuals and peoples as a whole, including environmental policies based on the best possible evidence and guaranteeing the precautionary principle. This commission has determined that there may be international responsibility of states for the lack of regulation or oversight of activities that contribute to foreseeable effects on human rights derived from environmental degradation, which includes an obligation to adopt preventive measures and to reduce exposure to harmful chemical substances that directly or indirectly affect the health of human beings, including reproductive health. Behind these grave human rights violations, there are many lives and many communities. One such story is that of Yaneth Valderrama. We have a short video where her son and her daughter narrate her story and the exposure to agrotoxins and the impact they had on the family.
Mis dos hijitas y el embarazo iba bien y eso es lo que duele porque ella estaba.
I was living with my 2 children and my wife, and the pregnancy, she had been sprayed with glyphosate. And they asked her, where was she? She was washing clothes, and she started running when she heard that noise, a loud noise, 3 airplanes and 1 helicopter. So she started running towards the house, but she wasn't able to get in the house. And all of that spraying was right on top of the house and everything those airplanes were unloading. In 2020, the center. So we went to bed around 8 p.m., and I heard she was still alive. I said, "What's wrong? Are you?" And she said she felt sick, that she was having stomach problems, and she couldn't. So the doctor examined her and said, "No, we have to do something." About 3 days later, she says, "I'm having cramps." So she went back to the hospital, and there she died. She died on March 23rd, 1999. That's what hurts. To have a young person killed. She was 27 years old when this happened. It's going to be harder every day and more complicated for me to know that they ended my mother's life just because they were farming. So I hope there's no more spraying of this, and for the government not to pretend that it's not their fault, because they are allowing this. those organizations present here today are here to ask you so that this type of thing, such as Janet's tragedy, doesn't occur again, and to apply the Inter-American solution to take effective measures to stop these human rights violations that these people that are being exposed to this. The first thing, giving visibility to this serious situation in the annual report of this commission. Second, to recommend that the precautionary principles be applied with a gender and racial approach. We think respectfully that any use of pesticides should consider existing scientific evidence that is not affected by conflicts of interest, and also take into account the disproportionate impacts that this has on women and girls living in rural areas and on people and racialized people in communities who suffer the worst part of this. Third, recommending improved access to comprehensive health services, especially in regard to reproductive health in affected rural areas. This includes improvement of epidemiological surveillance of these poisonings that affect them so that they can have some effective treatment. Fourth, recommending the adoption of measures to prevent exposure to pesticides. We believe there is a need to forbid the use of glyphosate because of its proven damage to reproductive health, as well as other health issues that it causes, because it is not when it is sprayed in this manner, it is impossible to control where the pesticide falls, and therefore it implies that it contaminates water, air, and soil. Fifth, we request that the access to justice be improved. You have to consider the serious difficulties for these people that are affected by these pesticides to prove the causal link between such exposure and the damage they suffered. Consideration should be given to adopting measures such as reversing the burden of proof to ensure effective access that will include measures with a gender and racial focus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I turn quickly over to the Commission for their response or questions, and I will start with Commissioner Mantier.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman, President, and civil society for the work that you're doing and all the work you all do daily on this issue. As you were saying, this is the first hearing on this subject. I wanted to get more information. You have already told us about the impact on reproductive health of women, but do you also have differentiated data regarding childhood, girls and boys, indigenous populations? And secondly, beyond everything you have told us, are there any good practices in public policy, either for prevention or reparation? And do you also know if there are administrative and legal procedures to claim and complain about this effect and health treatment? So apart from the reproductive health impact, I wanted to ask of any impact on mental health, depression, suicide attempts, if you have any data on this at an individual level because of people that are being affected by the glyphosate specifically, but also their families because they perhaps have to leave the area or move. Do you have information on this? And I'm also thinking of what you were saying on the Truth Commission. Is there any information or response from the state, in this case, Colombia? Thank you.
Over to Jorge Mesa.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Bueno, saludarla.
Thank you very much, President. We understand that the Commission will eventually study this. We cannot offer a solution right away. But I would like to ask a question of the cases that you know in general and access to justice. They mentioned the principle of precautionary or cautionary measures or principle. What do you know about this?
Rapporteur?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner Lisa Mantilla, Jorge Mesa, and Secretary General. It is a pleasure to discuss this, in my case, the first period of sessions as the rapporteur for this area. This is a subject that I have worked on at different times during my life. I am from Uruguay, and Uruguay is one of the countries that is most affected by the use of these agro-pesticides or toxins, even though it's not at the scale as others. But we're a small country, so it affects us. So this is something that is serious, regional. It goes beyond borders. The same as capital and money. Those companies that use and produce these agrotoxins. In any case, none of these characteristics know borders. They do not exist for any of them, and especially in South America, where I know the situation in better fashion. And also the persistence. It's been decades that we have been presencing how governments change, public policies, government plans, strategies, ministerial strategies. However, the situation of the use of these agro-pesticides and the effects they have on health, nutrition, water, decent, noble work, and reproductive health seem to somehow continue to be a situation where these rights are being violated, and they have not been taken on sufficiently by the governments. Everything that you have exposed here today, and we thank you for it, regarding the great amount or the use of these agrotoxins in our region. From Redesca, we have included this subject on many of our meetings and reports regarding Brazil, Colombia. We have made it clear that we are concerned about the generalized sale and use of agrotoxins and chemicals. We have documented in our reports how they affect the right to health and nutrition. Many of these that affect human rights, and they are these pesticides. In the case of Brazil, which is one of the main users, we have also included this information regarding other countries in the region, such as Colombia. And this has been in recent years. What I'm trying to say here is that for Redesca, this has been an important issue and will continue to be so. It is something that transcends basic areas that have to do with the environment and public policies that are necessary regarding how they regulate companies and human rights, but they have a direct link to health, nutrition, and things that have to do with the need to go find another place where to live. These are things that imply leaving a territory which is where your family always existed, and has to do with lifestyles of indigenous peoples. So it is something that somehow synthesizes a good measure of was the reason why the ICHR created Redesca. From that point of view, I wanted to let you know that we are committed to continue working on this, and the will to obtain, and please send us all the information you can for our monitoring work. And in the future, we'll have the opportunity to have more meetings and more conversations from where the special rapporteurship and the ICHR can continue to supervise and monitor the situation, which is especially relevant for our region. Thank you.
I very much appreciate the presentation of civil society and the connections that you make to the use of pesticides and political economy, not only of your country, but a kind of a global political economy. And I think it was Mr. Maldonado, you started off by referencing the inequalities in the ownership and use of natural resources. So I think you said 40% of the land, I think in Brazil, the agricultural land in Brazil is owned by 1% of the population, and presumably they're using that land for profit enterprises. And those for-profit enterprises, they also use pesticides and maybe other forms of chemicals, not only like fertilizers, to maximize the yield and therefore the profit. So I think that's an important place to begin, and to connect that to how widespread the use of pesticides, and I also want to always say fertilizers, because I think that's a big part of the problem in this region. And I was really struck by the figure that Catherine, you gave. 51% of the global use is in Latin America, and probably in a few countries in Latin America, so you can really get a sense of what the crisis may be for the populations who are in those surrounding areas. Because in fact, pesticides have such a totalizing negative impact on populations, as you have said, everyone has said, polluting everything, soil, the water, the air, then obviously consequentially food supplies, fish, in the water, and other spaces. We're not talking about pesticides, but we're talking, for example, in mining, the mercury. The extraction for profit, for extreme profit, is really damaging to human health and the environment, and I think there's no question about that. So this also connects, Special Rapporteur, to many of the other issues that you will be working on. I wanted to, and also say this is an issue here in Latin America, but in the Caribbean we have the issue of the use of something called, I went to look at it because I remembered as you were talking, chlordicone, which is a pesticide used on bananas for 2 decades, which are causing many of the same impacts, generational impacts on health in the countries, in the islands where they use that on the banana production in the 70s and the 80s. So so we know there's a lot of there are many problems, and so what I wanted to maybe ask, I want to ask maybe 2 or 3 questions, maybe naively, but okay, I'm going to be guilty to naivety right now. Do you have any promising examples of a state in the Americas and the Caribbean that have taken on the obligation to regulate the use of chemicals in agriculture? Are there examples that can be shared as part of this exercise? And do you also have any examples of the state holding non-state actors to account for the damage done by pesticides on the health of surrounding communities? And also I very much agree with this idea of the reverse burden of care, because someone living in a remote community in agricultural, they don't have the resources to find the scientists and the science and do the causal chain. So, are there any examples of that burden being reversed in our region and really anywhere else? Yeah, I think those are my, and then also, you reference the need for environmental impacts assessments. And I'm wondering, are there, again, any examples of that, even in Brazil and in Colombia, where you've been doing your advocacy? Has the advocacy moved the needle towards more state accountability and state regulation? Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias a los
Thank you very much to the Commissioner and Secretary and the Rapporteur for all your comments. First, we're going to let Daniel Bertanyasi, who is here with us virtually, and will refer to some of the questions that have been asked, especially regarding the impact on health, and eventually could also give us any cases of good practices in the case of Argentina. So, Daniel, please, if you're listening, thank you very much to the Commission for their questions. In the first place, I think it is important to say that the harm that these these generations have been exposed to does not end there, because there are scientific studies that say that if you expose a mother to even lower concentrations of glyphosate, generate a cell structure that affects even a third generation from that woman. So it has been demonstrated that children suffer from this impact even more so, because there are metabolic functions that are altered during the first years of life that then cannot be discontinued further on. And this study was done in 2014. There are also studies that have demonstrated how childhood that is being exposed in gestation have a great possibility of developing these congenital things that affect them. There are studies in Paraguay that have shown this there is harm, genetical harm, and it is more so in children that live in these rural areas as opposed to children from cities. And these rural schools have also been studied, so these are genetic harm or diseases that are created by these agrotoxins. And those people who live in rural areas are more affected than those in urban areas. So there is a greater impact in children and on women of reproductive age. It is also important to say that there was a scientific study 15 years ago by a university in the south of Brazil that found that there were more suicides in this rural communities because of the harm done by these agrotoxins. In biomedical terms, there is no scientific study right now that can state that they are harmless to human health. This is why we're stating what these practices, because there is no one that uses a poison that can destroy human cells should be used if we're taking care of human life. Thank you very much. So Marcia Sarpa now will explain more on health, because in Abrasco, this Brazilian organization, they have a long history of researching the impact of agrotoxins. And they have done more than most of these associations at a worldwide level. Thank you very much. The problem of reproductive health related to these toxins, we are still waiting effective action from the Health Department of Brazil, even though the country's economy is based on agricultural production. With the use of these agrotoxins, we have observed that there is no concern to control the impact of these toxins in the country and the health of human beings or how it affects the environment. On the contrary, in Brazil, the use of these pesticides has intensified in the last decades. This includes agrotoxins that have been forbidden or restricted in other countries, agrotoxins that actually don't even control the plagues in the crops that they are being used for. So you cannot see this in great measure. And chronic diseases that are associated to pesticides let us know that the effects on reproductive health are hidden in our country because of a lack of notifying of these effects. So everything that is related to reproductive health are what tell us that there is a need to forbid or at least register these agrotoxin in Brazil. Our legislation and a law in 1989, when an agrotoxin causes harm to reproductive health, that product should be forbidden, should not be sold in Brazil. However, due to the lack of a registry for all of these products, then these toxins are being used because they're invisible to the health departments in Brazil. And reproductive health are related to endocrine and their health, and there are effects on gestation, children, fetuses, and other late effects that are considered transgenerational. When we speak of vital happenings for health, we should not forget all of this. So our proposals from our Association of Public Health, we are proposing some important issues to debate the improvement of these regulations and to also report the harmful effects of these active agrotoxins and review the supervision by the competent authorities. And we need training on reproductive health and agrotoxins so that all health professionals have knowledge of the effects of them and can notify and tell people about them. So instruments should be created so that they allow civil society to denounce risk situations and of those who have been exposed to these agrotoxins. It is also important to develop supervisory programs by the responsible authorities of states that are responsible for these agrotoxins and their introduction. When the environment is contaminated, human health is also contaminated. So to supervise these markets throughout the country and strengthen inspections and the industry and those who create agrotoxins or produce agrotoxins, and also have these registries that of those substances that are harmful to human health and have their purpose be to reduce the exposure to agrotoxins in our country. Thank you, Marcia. We will let Emiliano tell us a bit about justice, focusing on justice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to remind you that the situation that we're living, and this is why I'm stressing it, is extremely serious. The level of poisoning of the Latin American populations are breaking records year after year. In Brazil, in the last decade, the number of agrotoxins was doubled In 2010, we had about 300,000 tons. In the last data, we have 720,000 tons. So those substances that have been approved in the last 4 years, half of them are forbidden in European Union. So as a law professor, this makes me ask, where is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Are we all equal? Or is it that these corporations and companies, they won last year $13 billion by selling forbidden substances in their countries, and they were selling it to Latin America. So we want this commission to take this into account. That, unfortunately, is the reality in all regions and countries in the region. And also, Rapporteur, we welcome what you have said. We had already spoken to the last Rapporteur. And from the south of the country, where I come from in the south of Uruguay, the having soy being produced in the Pampa region, that because the soy expansion or production has expanded, we are doing away with many things, but the cancer levels have increased and suicides, as the commissioner was asking. Mainly in the regions where tobacco is being grown, suicide is quite a serious problem. And where soy has been expanding to, and in a region of central Brazil, there's a serious problem related to indigenous territories for the Guaranis and the Aiwas people. These are cases that the Commission has analyzed. There are psychological effects and malicious poisoning of people in these situations. So I would like to also ask for the rapporteur and the Commission to include in their report the problem that will begin. We're already living this situation, but if the package of poison this is a draft law 1459 that is at the National Congress in Brazil, and that law will make more flexible whatever we have to control agrotoxins already, and it will guarantee the broadening of the authorization of these substances to make them possible to use. And thinking of some substances, we'd like to point out that it is urgent that that double standard that exists to the sale of these products and the use of these products, citronil, which has been destroying our pollinators. We have a great number of bees in Brazil, and for farmers, bees are a helper. They're their allies, but we're killing all these bees. So this type of pollination now is being done by aerial sprays. So this is done in many countries and is being used more and more. And in the study that we mentioned of these 30 cases that were studied by many researchers of the universities in Brazil, it was revealed that 70% of poisoning or contamination cases were related to that type of pollination. So what the farmers are telling us, or rather spraying, not pollination, I'm sorry. So they were real rains of poison, said the farmers. And so there should be more rigorous supervision on this. As an example of good practices, I'd like to point out the case of a new state in the state of Ceará, northeast Brazil, where it was forbidden to spray aerially these agrotoxins. So that law was questioned at an internal and national level, but the court acknowledged or authorized that, and the cases of contamination with that in that province were reduced after that law was passed when its effects were questioned. So that is one way to eliminate that type of contamination.
In the state of Rio Grande do Sul, I think we have a best practice. This banned the sale of substances that had not been authorized in the country in which they had been manufactured. If you look at data from other provinces, we were able to verify that water contamination in Rio Grande do Sul was less than that in other provinces. So these are measures that could be replicated. They have a direct impact. In the most recent national study on water contamination, approximately 27 agrotoxins were identified, and all capitals in the provinces had contaminated water. 28 cities had alarming levels of contamination that would require specific policies to clean that water so that it was fit for human consumption. I would also like to underscore the best practices being implemented in many of these communities in terms of climate change and the need to have a different way to engage with nature. And these are already being done in some of the rural communities in Porto Alegre. They have the largest volume of agricultural or the ecological rice production in all of the Americas. However, this ecological rice is being contaminated because of air pollution. Many of the agrotoxins that we've been discussing are not fit for food products. That's why we keep talking about this double standard, which violates universal rights, and it's a new type of colonization. It's chemical colonization. It's molecular colonization. Thank you, Emiliano. Just to wrap it up, I will try to provide some responses in the context of Colombia. We agree with what Commissioner Julissa was saying. Yes, this has had an impact on mental health as well. In some of the most recent cases we studied in Antioquia, we conducted interviews with women who were directly impacted, but also with the community. In the testimony showed that there was individual impacts, the miscarriages, but also a breakdown of their feeling of being a community because of how widespread the spraying was. Much of it spilled over into other areas. People who were impacted had to deal with the poisoning of their soils, the poisoning of their waters. In many cases, they were not able to grow their crops anymore, even if they had a small piece of land, which in Colombia, it's a very complex system in rural communities. Even if they have access to their own land, they can't use it. They need to move to or go to other places to purchase their food because their land is no longer suitable. And so it's not just that they've poisoned people, they've ultimately destroyed the community. The families aren't there. All you can do is look at dying plants, wilting plants. These are biological impacts through the spraying, but also it has really led to a destruction of a way of life, people who live in these communities. This has had deep impacts. And again, in many cases, they need to go to cities, they need to move. That has an impact and forces them to change the way they live. In the case of access to justice, at least in the case of Colombia, the matter of burden of proof has made it virtually impossible for them to seek justice. In some cases, the only reparations possible has been one for loss of crops, because before it was clear that there had been crops and that those crops had disappeared. But in terms of impacts on health or even deaths, they would need very high-level technical toxicological studies that these people have no way of obtaining. They would need an expert to collect samples and to conduct tests. In case of poisoning in 1998 and 1999, they would have had to send those samples abroad. That's very costly. Then wait for the results to be returned and brought to the justice system. So again, it is virtually impossible to seek reparations because of the heavy burden of proof. That's why we were talking about the need to see changes in the evidentiary requirements, because it is truly impossible as the system exists. When we talk about the precautionary principle in Colombia, that had not been taken into account. There were some initial studies before the glyphosate spraying began, but they were completely ignored. And they started in 92 and they continued. There were even reports from the Office of the Comptroller, the Office of the Attorney General, and even the Office of the Ombudsperson, where they asked the government to put a halt to this spraying, but they continued. So this is something that was brought to the attention of the state, but nothing was done, and this led to severe harm in these communities. And on top of that, the healthcare system was not enhanced to deal with the impacts. So these individuals in rural communities don't have any access to any way of treating the poisoning. This is why we think that the precautionary principle should be taken into account, looking at the differentiated impact, what you've heard from all of us here. We've seen impacts that impact women specifically. And so there's an enzyme that's very important for muscles and bones. In the case of women, we have lower levels of that enzyme. So women are going to be affected more than men will if they are exposed to some of these pesticides. So the studies have to look at the differentiated impact, the way these substances impact women versus men, and look at how they can affect communities as a whole. In Brazil, if you look at the areas that are most affected by exposure, you can look at race, and race is a huge factor. So people based on race are not being exposed at the same level. And so people of certain races are exposed less than those of other races. But studies never take into account these differences. And therefore, there is no way of preventing the disproportionate harm that certain communities have consistently suffered because of structural racism. The National Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics for a recommendation on glyphosate and said that in order to protect reproductive health globally, there should be a total ban on the use of glyphosate. So it's clear that experts in reproductive and sexual health have concluded that any exposure to glyphosate can have damaging impact on women and children. There's also what my colleague mentioned about epidemiological surveillance. In all healthcare systems, but even in the most basic healthcare systems, there has to be information and some way to respond to poisoning, whether it's severe acute poisoning or if it's chronic poisoning. And lastly, in the case of Colombia, I think it's important to note that while the Truth Commission did great work in terms of shedding light on the impacts of the armed conflict and exposure to chemicals, but they need budget to be able to implement the recommendations that came from the commission. We know that there's very good will from those who were part of the committee, but they need the means, financial and personnel means, to be able to implement this, because if not, there's no way they can implement it. In Colombia, there's another issue. It's the lack of information about the impact, because much of the discussion has been surrounding the drug policy and its use, but that's just 10% of total use of glyphosate in Colombia. In the case of Brazil and Argentina, where there's some regulations to limit the use of the substances, but in Colombia there are very few limits, so you can practically use any type of agrotoxin. And in many cases, this is where you see the use of those that are banned in the European Union, and they're just sent over to Colombia for use there. Thank you very much. We are very grateful to you for the attention that you are paying to this situation, and we would like to thank the commissioners and the special rapporteur for your attention.
Occurred to me when you were talking, do pesticides decompose in soil? And if so, how long does that take? And can soil be remediated?
Sí,
They do remain in the soil. It depends on the type of substance. The times can differ. But these substances are generally used in rural areas where there's contact to water, and so it lasts a long time. I can talk about a specific substance, atrazine, which is banned in the European Union and is contaminating water very severely in Brazil. It remains for many years. It stays present in the entire water cycle for years. A recent study from the Federal University of Mato Grosso demonstrated that in the region of Cerrado, air contamination, again, these contaminants remain many months beyond the application of the substances. Damian, who's joining us virtually, would like to add his 2 cents. There are scientific papers that have been published in international journals that demonstrate that glyphosate can remain in cells. There's no way of eliminating the residue of glyphosate either from the soil or from water. In Argentina, as the river moves to where it opens up into the sea, they see in the accumulation of some of the clay and mud where they have found high concentrations of agrotoxins. Thank you, Damian.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of a very informative hearing. You know, it really does underscore the challenges that we have in confronting a whole lot of interconnected violations, because as you have pointed out, use of pesticides and who it impacts cannot be at all disconnected from inequalities and the structural racism and structural injustice. And I just also want to end by noting your definition of reproductive justice, which is the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to a healthy, safe environment, which is for all of us. We need to demand that right and to work together to get states to be more attentive to their regulatory function and also their monitoring function and policy, the public policy function that they have to protect, respect, and fulfill all human rights. So I want to thank you for bringing this to the Commission's attention. I want to thank the commissioners and the special rapporteur for joining us, and to say we are at the end of this hearing, but we will go forward with your recommendations as we reflect on what we can actually do to advance this cause, this just cause. Thank you.